Chairman Graves, Ranking Member Norton, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to provide the perspective of the nation's state departments of transportation. My name is Patrick McKenna, and I serve as Director of the Missouri Department of Transportation. Today, it's my honor to testify on behalf of the great state of Missouri and AASHTO, which represents the transportation departments of all 50 states, Washington, D.C., and Puerto Rico. As members of Congress and the President consider building a transportation infrastructure package, please consider the following. The future of the Federal Highway Trust Fund must be secured through long-term sustainable revenue solutions. Direct federal funding is needed instead of relying solely on incentives that encourage the use of private capital or borrowing. Wherever possible, traditional federal authorities should be assigned to states to expedite and streamline project delivery. Priority should be given to transportation investments that secure our nation's future for the long term instead of shovel-ready projects. And the existing federal program structure, including highways, transit, and rail, should be utilized. This would enable investments to flow to every region of the country. The FAST Act was the first long-term funding legislation since 2005. This allowed for funding certainty and planning. It also increased the amount of federal funds available that can be matched with state dollars. Prior to the FAST Act, there was federal funding instability, and Missouri was in the difficult position of considering abandoning maintenance on 26,000 out of 34,000 miles of roadways. Since the passage of the FAST Act, Missouri has taken on more financial risk as a state and increased our capital budget by $3 billion over 5 years. I want to thank Chairman Graves and members of this committee for your work to pass the FAST Act and to appeal for your continued action to create funding stability. The United States Department of Transportation notes in 2015 that state and local governments provided 80% of funds invested in highway and bridge programs and 74% of funds invested in transit programs. I cite these numbers because AASHTO and its members disagree with any notion that federal transportation funding displaces or discourages state and local investment. As my example of FAST Act funding stability shows, Missouri increased its budget alongside and as a result of federal investment. The Highway Trust Fund has provided stable, reliable, and substantial highway and transit funding for decades, but this is no longer the case. According to the Congressional Budget Office, annual Highway Trust Fund spending is estimated to exceed receipts by about $16 billion by 2021. Without your action, Missouri will be right back in the position we were prior to the FAST Act. Missouri could see a 40% reduction in funds, $400 million less for the state. Critical maintenance and improvements will stop. AASHTO believes that an infrastructure package must focus on direct grant funding rather than federal financing support. The state DOTs continue to support a role for financing and procurement tools such as public-private partnerships. We also maintain that financing instruments such as subsidized loans, tax-exempt municipal and private activity bonds, and infrastructure banks are insufficient to meet most types of transportation investment needs. Any new infrastructure plan should focus on the needs of rural America. Rural areas remain critical to the nation's economic success through the production and movement of goods such as agriculture and manufacturing products. AASHTO believes that we can improve program delivery by assigning some authorities traditionally assumed by the federal government to states that wish to participate, including federal funds obligation management, project agreements, and right-of-way acquisition, just to name a few. We ask Congress to consider establishing a project delivery pilot program. This program would develop innovative practices to streamline delivery and achieve positive environmental outcomes. Missouri has more than 1,000 miles of the Mississippi and Missouri rivers. $12.5 billion in cargo travels up and down those waterways each year. We've seen firsthand how investments can pay long-term dividends. In the past 5 years, $13 million in state investment in ports has led to $53 million in investment from the private sector. Missouri's cost share program enables us to leverage contributions from local communities with state and federal funds to advance construction priorities. Since inception, $450 million in state participation has led to the delivery of more than $1 billion of construction projects. We urge Congress to build on the partnership that has flourished between the federal government and state DOTs. The flexibility to let state and local governments select projects based on public input allows local partners to work together to meet the unique needs of both urban and rural areas. Please take the necessary steps to ensure that all modes of transportation, rail, airports, transit, and ports, have access to additional federal resources that will keep our citizens connected and provide economic growth. I want to thank you again for the opportunity to testify today, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you all. We're now going to recognize each member for 5 minutes for questions, and I'm going to start with Mr. Schuster, followed by Mr. DeFazio.
Thank you, Chairman Graves. As I said in the opening statement, I think one of the key components is we have to figure out a long-term funding stream. I know my colleague, Mr. DeFazio, was very passionate about that, as am I. He's come up with a funding plan that seems reasonable to me. There's probably, I don't know, 10 or a dozen of them out there. And when you come up with a new plan to try to educate members of Congress on it, it's very, very difficult. I'm trying to do that on a bill right now with an FAA bill that I have some members that don't seem to understand what I'm trying to do. But again, when you're moving forward with a funding stream, long-term sustainable, let's keep it simple. We have one in place now. We ought to be looking at that one very closely before we start going off on different new ideas because it's very efficient. The math is pretty simple and straightforward, but I'm open to everything, and that has to be a priority for me on how do we fund this so, as I said earlier, we don't kick the can down the road. But I think we also have to be thinking outside the box, ways to bring dollars in. Public-private partnerships are not a silver bullet. Let me say that again. Public-private partnerships aren't a silver bullet, but it's a hell of a good tool to have in the tool bag. And there's some new ones out there that we ought to be looking at. And I'm going to ask the question about asset recycling. And my colleagues, some of my colleagues on the other side say, you want to sell all our assets. You don't, if you look at the Australian model, what they did, they hardly sold any assets. They leased them. Leasing is far different than selling. Leasing is you still retain the ownership of it. You allow somebody to come in, turn that asset into cash over time, and the idea is to have a bonus payment to do that. And again, the Australian model, we met with Ambassador Hockey now, the former or the architect of this program in Australia. And the first question of a group of Republicans was, the Chinese are going to buy all our assets. And the Australians said, no, they didn't. We wouldn't let them. Now, they're investors, but they don't control them. They're not on the boards. So again, it's money, and money is around the world that's out there. There's trillions of dollars that money would love to invest in America's infrastructure projects. And they're not looking for a 8 and 10% return if you're doing a 30 or 40 year deal. They're good with 3 and 3.5%. Some of these pension funds, even our own unions in this country are looking at that. I was talking to a building trades union the other day, and they're investing their money in Canadian infrastructure. It's heresy, isn't it? Building trades investing in a foreign country? No, they're doing it because it's making money for the folks that they're responsible for their pensions. So I think asset recycling is something we ought to consider. We ought to look at what the Australians have done with it, and to all accounts, they've generated over $20 billion in just a very short period of time on top of what they spend. So again, I would ask Mr. McKenna and Mr. Roberts and Mr. Booker to respond to that first. Just your thoughts, if you're even familiar with asset recycling and what you think the prospects are.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, and in fact, the way we look at this is you really have to look at these things on a project-by-project basis. You have to look at the benefit to the taxpayers, the cost of capital, and do the analysis on a complicated project to determine if advancing the construction on that particular facility is not available through other means, what's the benefit to the taxpayers in terms of reduction in congestion, enhanced facilities. The recycling has been done at a number of airports. We're looking at it in Missouri at a couple airports as well. And then make sure that you're playing out those costs and benefits. Like you said, it's a tool in the toolbox, and I think that's appropriate for us to have all the tools we can. This is a large problem we have to solve all over the country, and we need all the tools we can to do so.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. We did have a special select committee of members here appointed by the chairman 4 years ago. We met for more than a year, heard from many people in a real hearing and interchange format about P3s, and we put out a bipartisan consensus report. And the conclusion was that if you look at America's broad infrastructure needs, P3s with the best facilitation through law can deal with somewhere between 10 and 12% of our infrastructure needs. So that still leaves a hell of a lot on the table, 88 to 90%. So yes, P3s, fine. Well-regulated P3s, great. But that's not a solution. And it's not even the major tool in the toolbox, and it can't be. There's a really interesting new statistic, which is that the toll rate per mile for a P3 toll road is 30 cents. And the rate for a non-P3 toll road is 14 cents. That does raise some questions about what we're going to do to the American driving public and the trucking industry if we're going to go principally down the P3 route. So these things need to be discussed thoroughly. Also, what we found in doing that report was that almost every large P3 out there is substantially funded by the federal government. They all use TIFIA for 80 to 90% of their needs. So yeah, the private capital puts up 10, 15%, and then they turn to the federal government. So I think it points to the absolute essential need for us to have a robust long-term spending stream, and one that delivers things to the American public at the least cost. And direct federal partnership with the states is the way to do that. And just to comment on the salesman down at the Australian embassy who I met with, yeah, they did it for 2 years. It was such a grand success, they did it for 2 years. And most of the money went to two of their provinces. And one was New South Wales, who had been selling things off for years on their own. And then they got an extra bonus payment from the federal government to do yet another sale of assets that they'd already been doing. So here, if we follow that model, we'll take gas tax dollars, which don't exist and are already in short supply, and we will go to local jurisdictions who already have the authority, if they so wish, to sell off their ports or their airports or whatever they want to do. That's up to the local jurisdiction. The federal government doesn't need to bribe them with dollars that we don't have to do that. It was a dumb idea in Australia. The new government came in. They said, hey, we're done with that. Put all the remaining money back into the national program and directly distributes it back out across the country. So it didn't work there. It's not going to work here. And we just shouldn't get down that false path. So, Mr. McKenna, I agree with everything you said. Has your organization presented these ideas to this administration?
We have been participating with roundtable discussions that have occurred. We certainly support, and AASHTO supports a robust discussion on the baseline funding. But we also understand that we have to have flexibility in the program as well. And state DOTs are recognizing the fact that we have to look at procurement methods that maybe are not just the simple procurement methods of the past, that we have to open ourselves up in the case of particular projects that are very complicated and very difficult to structure financially. We're looking at those possibilities, design build finance, those types of things. Those are good, and they actually help us work even closer with our construction partners to bring innovative solutions to the engineering problems that we face. So it's a combination itself. It's not a one-size-fits-all, but DOTs have to open up to our own approach as well, because that's part of the solution also.
No, I totally agree with you on that, and the federal government should facilitate that, not hobble them by prescriptive means with attached to our dollars, but you would still say that a robust additional federal investment is still critical to most states.
Yes.
All right.
I did want to ask Mr. McKenna a question because he represents the whole state of Missouri, and he spoke about the immediate crisis in rural areas. I couldn't agree more. If we're having trouble in what is a relatively wealthy area in this region, I can't imagine what if we go into Southern Virginia, for example. They must be going through. But you represent an entire state. And while you called attention to the immediate crisis in rural areas, I wonder what you'd say about cities like St. Louis or Kansas City that have pressing needs at the same time. What I'm trying to get to, Mr. McKenna, is what this committee has always avoided, and that is pitting one part of the region against another part, going back to the Eisenhower administration, the recognition that this was one vast network. So I am the first to acknowledge the immediate crisis. I don't see how rural areas are able to do anything. I wonder how you bring together, you who represent the entire state, big cities like St. Louis and Kansas City, with places that can't possibly fund any of their transportation or very few of their transportation needs, like your rural roads.
Well,
If the gentlelady would yield just a second too, I'd like to add to that just the insurance of those, rural areas across the country. How do we ensure that they aren't left out in this process?
Yes.
Well, thank you for the question. In Missouri, what we do is we allocate the limited resources that we have based on objective criteria. It's similar to the allocation that's done by Congress with the Surface Transportation Bill, and that's why we think that's so important. When we look at our rural areas, for instance, we're just now undertaking a replacement of the Champ Clark Bridge, which connects parts of rural Missouri with Illinois. Had we not had that underway, our rural communities would have a 77-mile detour if that bridge went down. It was built originally in 1928. But likewise, we have structures in St. Louis and Kansas City that carry 120,000 cars a day. So it all comes down to dollars and cents and how you allocate those, I think. An objective criteria for allocating resources is critical so that neither area feels that they've been disadvantaged over the other. We use population, we use employment data, we use size of the infrastructure, vehicle miles traveled, and square footage of bridge deck to allocate capital resources among the regions. So the urban areas receive a larger share of the pie, but they should. And the rural areas receive their relative share. What happens is it's very difficult to move the needle on large projects like a major river crossing. This is a $60 million enterprise for us. And we do have to build up resources over years to subsidize that area to be able to make that, because your point is taken that this entire system is connected. And if we let any of those connections go down, we're disconnecting the communities themselves. So it's the allocation of resources objectively, I think, is an antidote to that, but recognizing that there's not enough money coming into the top line to satisfy all the needs in any of the regions is really critical.
Mr. Schuster, and finally, Chairman Schuster made a very important point. And it perhaps wasn't beneficial to where he represents. And he said that rural areas pay more in gas tax. But then he pointed out what they get back in overfunding. And again, if we lose that notion, that you don't ultimately lose by the funding of a network of transportation and infrastructure, then we've lost the great American transportation lesson. I thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Gibbs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Of course, first question may go to Mr. McKenna or Mr. McCartney. We made a lot of progress, I think, in the FAST Act, encouraging intermodal transportation through the National Highway Freight Program and other initiatives. How can we improve on that and in an infrastructure package? Do you see that freight program working, and what kind of improvements? Go ahead, Mr. Marker.
Thank you for the question, and we appreciate that. From the manufacturer's standpoint, we're not safety experts, and we need someone to be able to tell us reliable safety scores. We have right now manufacturing members of the National Association of Manufacturers who were ordered to trial by judge after they hired a twice satisfactory rated motor carrier because the judge was confused whether the data presented by the plaintiff or the two satisfactory safety ratings indicated that the motor carrier had been deemed safe to operate on the nation's highways by the FMC.
I think you're answering my second question I was going to ask.
Okay.
My first question was about the freight program.
Yes.
If I might, thank you for the question, Representative. We feel that the freight program is actually focusing our efforts as a state, and it's doing so reasonably. We think that the provisions of both MAP 21 and the FAST Act that encouraged every state to put together a freight plan and to work with their local partners to do so as a baseline for further investment was important. We did so in Missouri in 2014, and we're actually using that as the baseline for a lot of our primary cost benefit on our construction projects that we're looking at. We know that a secondary benefit will occur when we remove these freight bottlenecks to encourage commerce. There'll be a passenger benefit as well. And a safety benefit on top of that. So I think it is working, and I think that remaining to have that focus is important.
We're being outcompeted by China and other countries that are robustly investing in their infrastructure, and we don't have 20 or 40 years to wait to get on with it. Mr. McCarty, you encapsulated the remarks of many of the manufacturers in my district who are looking at us and saying, how can I possibly compete when I can't get my goods to market and I can't even get my workers here to the factory? That's the number one complaint in my state of Connecticut is actually transportation, more than taxes, more than anything else. And so this problem has been brewing for decades. Everybody here has mentioned it. We need revenue. We need revenue when you can do financing, and I think a lot of us are open to creative ways of financing, but we have a serious revenue problem. We've relied historically on user fees. The world is changing. Cars are more efficient. We didn't index the gas tax. We're having alternative fuels. A number of members of Congress here drive vehicles that don't pay any gas tax whatsoever. So we need to look down the road. My kids never take cars. They use a car-sharing service. We're looking at autonomous vehicles. So I'd like all of you to help with us think about how are we going to look at those aspects? How are we going to be evaluating projects based on future infrastructure needs when we have such rapidly changing technology, rapidly changing usage patterns, increasing urbanization, which Mr. Rogoff talked about. We're going to be needing to do a lot more transit if you look at the demographic patterns. So that's happening very fast, and we're going to need your help in thinking that through. So that's one question. Another one is on the P3s. One of the concerns I have, and I think they need to be part of the mix, but that prioritizes making revenue not necessarily what is in the public's interest in meeting those needs. So it meets certain kinds of projects. It may be very smart for something like high-speed rail in the Northeast, where you know their actual high-speed rail would have a revenue stream and you need massive investment. Maybe that works. For a lot of things, it doesn't. I'd love to hear your thoughts on life cycle costs and fix it first. A lot of my concern, again, with the creative financing mechanisms are they tend not to deal with actually fixing current infrastructure. It prioritizes something that can create a new revenue stream. And living in an older part of infrastructure in the Northeast, you know, we're concerned. And I do want to point out my state is one of those states that has continued to raise the gas tax. And yet, some of the proposals on the table, and Mr. Lipinski and Mr. Davis and I were at the White House 2 weeks ago, and they are talking about incentivizing states to step up. Well, my state's been stepping up for some time now. So I think it's really important that we not punish states who have already taken those steps to reward ones that have not. So just a few questions, and anyone who wants to get started. Thank you.
With regard to looking at the entire capital plan, I think we have to look at this whole bill really like a company would look at an investment portfolio. There's not a particular solution that's going to meet the needs of every region of the country uniformly. From a standpoint of AASHTO and from a standpoint of a state DOT, the flexibility, opening up the flexibility of the surface transportation so that states can meet their local needs. We have a planning framework that we go through utilizing metropolitan planning organizations and regional planning commissions that the needs of those communities, they know best what their needs are, whether it's new construction, expansion for capacity, or fixing the existing system. And the flexibility to utilize the federal funds in concert with those local needs, I think, is a critical aspect.
Hey, quick question for everybody on the panel. Raise your hand if you think that we can stabilize and solidify the Highway Trust Fund by just raising the gas tax. Oh, you guys have listened well to the people behind you, because they usually get asked the same question by us. And that's what's great about this hearing, because we're actually finally talking about diversification. You know, it's Peter DeFazio's rage over the fact that we haven't addressed many issues that we listened to a few minutes ago, well, a long few minutes ago now. And Schuster talking about, I think, is part of that diversification, asset recycling, P3s. The discussion here is very bipartisan. The discussion that Ms. Esty and Mr. Lipinski and a few of us others had at the White House the other morning was centered on infrastructure and how do we be able to, how do we solidify and how do we stabilize our infrastructure dollars? Everybody's got a lot of ideas. Why can't we use them all? Now, diversification is something I've been talking about since I got here 4.5 years ago. How do we diversify? What do we do to make sure that we're ready for the next generation of vehicles? I think we all agree, because none of you raised your hand, that the gas tax is the only answer, that how on one hand can we have our highway trust fund funded by one source that the same federal government, all of us that are participants in, how do we tell you to burn less of it? I think what should scare everybody sitting at that table and everybody here is that we've got countries like France that say in the next 20 years they don't want a single gasoline-powered vehicle on their roadway. Let's say President Macron is half right. What does that mean for the percentage of electric vehicles that are on our roadways? And what are we going to be able to do to actually have a trust fund? Imagine when electric technology gets into the fleet level. What will that do besides decimate our highway trust fund? So our job is to plan. And we can sit and we can talk about putting these ideas together. We can talk about diversification. But in the end, we actually got to come up with a plan that's going to get votes. And all sides are going to have to sit down instead of just discuss solutions like we're doing today. What's going to get us to an actual bill that's going to pass? And that's where we need your help. Because we all agree something has to be done. But the funny thing about Washington is those details are the things that kind of stick us up. Now, you all agree that we need diversification. Who wants to be the first one to tell me what plan is going to work best? Anybody? Mr. McKenna. Thank you for talking about rural Illinois, too. Great place.
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, again, when we talk about diversification, I think we have to recognize that as fuel efficiency increases, the revenue will decrease in the gas tax. I'd like to point out something that...
Because the federal government is telling manufacturers to create engines that burn less.
Well, and I'd like to point out something that's going on in the state of Georgia right now. In 2015, one of the AASHTO members actually put an inflator onto their gas tax. They raised their gas tax as a baseline. Then they put an inflator on that in part used the fuel economy of the entire Georgia vehicle fleet. So that just kicked in this past year. It created an adjustment so that they didn't lose any money into their own revenue based on the rising fuel economy. So we're going to have to look for things that create some way to adjust through to the new future, but not to forget the baseline of what the funding is that will get us there.
So, Mr. McKenna, I have a question for you first. Missouri's State Freight Plan notes that truck volume is projected to increase by over 50% between 2011 and 2030. Across the country, cargo volumes are up to record highs, and addressing this strain on our freight network is a key challenge in the years forward. I represent the port area in Long Beach, and adjacent to LA. We've had the highest amount of growth, LA, in years. Long Beach recently had the highest 1 month total. The question I have to you is, do you feel like states like yours, our key freight corridors, will have the resources they need to meet the increased volume without a dedicated freight infrastructure funding from the federal government?
Thank you for the question. I do not believe we have the resources required to meet that need. I don't believe we have the resources required at present to meet the current need. So we welcome the focus on freight. It is a critical aspect of our economy in the state, and we are focused on that element. We'll be bringing a infra grant forward as part of the discretionary program in the coming couple weeks, and we're focused on freight.
Thank you. Next question is for the entire panel. The FAST Act in 2015 created a new program to direct federal investment to critical freight infrastructure needs. However, the administration recently announced changes to that would reduce this program's emphasis on the most worthy projects and instead advantage projects with a low federal cost share. How does this new emphasis affect our ability to invest in critically needed freight infrastructure improvements now that we're just going to go to those that have the lowest federal cost? I'd like anybody to tell how we're going to deal with this issue. Mr. McCarty.
Yes, thank you. You know, as you start prioritizing things, what we have done in Missouri, and I'm sure it's done in other places, is we've had, as the director mentioned, we have these MPOs and these regional organizations that try to prioritize what their needs are. We don't have the luxury of trying to even analyze how much money we're getting back or what the match is. We're looking at where the needs really are. And really, the needs are really all over the place. From a manufacturer's standpoint, we want to make sure the entire system is connected, and I think that's important. So you have to look at connectivity as well.
But the question, and I agree with you completely about connectivity, and I believe a multimodal approach that really deals with connectivity is critically needed, so I concur with you. But I want to ask you about the administration's approach to now prioritize freight infrastructure by looking at those that advantage programs that have a low federal cost share versus what was done in the FAST Act to look at the most worthy projects. That's quite a bit of difference. Anybody have any thoughts about what the administration has recently done? So it doesn't make any difference to you that we're going to just target those projects that have the smallest amount of federal cost sharing. Mr. McKenna?
I think what we're looking at is that they overlap. Those that are most significant to the state, most significant to the region, will also draw additional support from local share. We have a cost share program in our state, and that is playing out. So we're acting on a discretionary basis to look for those things that align both, that we can bring local resources to bear where we can and try to up our share.
Obviously, since the federal government is reducing its responsibility and has been, you have to look at other local sources. But do you agree that we should be looking at you said that you've kind of trying to do a balance between those that are both locally funded, larger cost share, and also those that are the most worthy projects. But I don't think that's where the administration has gone. They have not really talked about the most worthy projects.
Mr. McKenna, your state of Missouri is to the north of Arkansas. You've got Interstate 49 that runs along the western side of Missouri up to Kansas City. Interstate 49 is a connector between New Orleans and Kansas City. The remaining undone part of Interstate 49 happens to be in my district. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of completing these projects and how that, even though you've got this beautiful highway from the really from Fort Smith, Arkansas, all the way up to Kansas City, and from Ashdown, Arkansas, down to New Orleans, what having that two-lane curvy road undone means to the rest of the transportation on Interstate 49?
Thank you, Representative. Great question. We, as you mentioned, we have about 5 miles of interstate to complete, kind of a combined project between Missouri and Arkansas. And it just shows, you know, we are not complete even with the build out of the interstate system in its original capacity, but the benefits to the region itself, very substantially growing region in that part of the country, and the movement of freight and the movement of people and the economic well-being of that region is critically tied to that particular completion. You know, we are some $35 to $40 million away from that completion point, and that's one where when we allocate limited resources, both states have for 30 years, one state has had the funding and been ready and another state hasn't, and we've kind of traded places in that a couple times. It's frustrating for us. I know it's frustrating for you in your region, but these are the types of investments that can go a long way to really connect the people of the region as well as beyond the region, as you said, going all the way to New Orleans.
And really connecting to the rest of the world through the ports there in New Orleans. Do you believe the federal government gives an honest look at the entire system when they're designating funds for these new projects, or do you think there could be improvements there?
Well, I think the main issue is the amount of money coming into the top. You know, what we have in the region, we look at it and have discussions frequently that we have equitably distributed dissatisfaction throughout the whole system. that we are fair in our allocation. It's just not enough being allocated. We try to make the best decisions we can, but we're focused on critical maintenance and taking care of existing system and preservation beyond expansion at this point right now, and we need both.
Okay, and shifting gears a little bit, we're talking about different kinds of funding streams. I know from serving in my state legislature that in Arkansas at least, state and local taxes are collected on construction materials on projects that are funded with federal dollars. Now, Mr. McKenna, I think Missouri has an exemption for that where they exempt construction materials from state and local taxes. But since the communities where these infrastructure projects are built benefit from the infrastructure projects themselves, do you think it would be fair to ask state and local entities not to collect taxes on construction materials for projects that are funded with federal dollars? And I'd like to ask Mr. Roberts that question as well.
Well, I think what we really try to do is we do have a local cost share so that communities can actually raise local taxes, and what we've seen are communities have actually invested those in the federal system, in the state system, beyond their local municipalities. So we see a kind of a counteraction that occurs, so it kind of balances it out.
But ultimately, those state and local taxes are being paid with federal tax dollars if it's on a federally funded project.
What Mr. McKenna knows is that Russell McMurray, who leads our state DOT, presided over a project when the I-85 bridge burned down and collapsed in Georgia. 3 spans of bridge, not a square bridge, but a parabola of a bridge there, and we replaced it in 6 weeks. I didn't have one Tea Party, one conservative, one taxpayer advocate. I didn't have one constituent call and tell me they were angry about the $3 million performance bonus that we gave to C.W. Matthews for getting that job done 6 weeks, not just a 6-week project, but 6 weeks early on a 12-week project, and delivered what taxpayers believed was a value for their dollar. So you all represent a different facet of the industry. I tell that story all the time because it tells me what we can do together. Democratic mayor, bipartisan regional commission, Republican governor, all coming together to make those things happen. What's the story in your space that you would have me retell to tell folks, you know what, if you trust us with another $10 or $20 billion in the trust fund, we're not just going to flush it down the toilet. We're going to get you real value for real money. Who's got something to lift me up today? Mr. McKenna?
Yeah, I'll give you 2 examples, Representative. Number one, in Missouri, we have the same circumstance. We had major flooding in the spring. We had 384 roads closed. Our maintenance crews and our construction partners had 300 of those opened in 5 days. We're down to just 3, and we'll be complete by the end of this month. All 384 roads will be opened within 6 months of being closed. We also have a record of achievement. 4,661 construction projects have been completed by Missouri DOT and our construction partners in the last 10 years, 94% on time or early, and 7% under budget. That's $1 billion in savings, and that's gone right back into the construction program itself.
7% under budget?
7%.
Many people voted for Donald Trump because he promised to make America great again by growing the economy and creating high-paying middle-class jobs by rebuilding America's crumbling infrastructure. Isn't that correct, Mr. Booker?
That's correct.
And Mr. McKenna, do you believe that we can make America great again by rebuilding our roads, bridges, and tunnels if we replace real federal gas tax revenues with public-private partnerships?
I believe it requires we do both.
Do you believe that one would be, or public-private partnerships alone can do it?
Well, you know, when I look to my left on this panel, public-private partnerships have existed in transportation for over 100 years. States, the federal government, and our construction industry. It's already in place.
Well, recently the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal reported that President Trump stated that he no longer believes that public-private partnerships will solve our infrastructure funding needs. Do you disagree with President Trump?
I believe it's part of a tool in the toolbox. It's a procurement method. It's not necessarily a funding method. It's one of the tools that might help particular projects in particular regions of the country.
Well, my colleague from Illinois, my good friend, Representative Davis, asked you all to raise your hands if you believe that raising the gas tax alone will take care of the problems with the Highway Trust Fund. And it was duly noted that no one raised their hand, and none of you on the panel raised your hand. I want you to raise your hand if you believe that the federal gas tax will remain viable for fixing our crumbling infrastructure, given the fact that we have 253 million gas-powered vehicles on the roads in the country today versus only 540,000 electric vehicles. Raise your hand if you believe that the tax, the federal gas tax, will remain viable to fix our crumbling infrastructure.
I'm struggling with remain viable.
I see 4 out of 5 with the transit guy not raising his hand, and I would love to ask him about that in a second. Probably for a reason unrelated to the answer to the question. But I want you, so record reflects, you all believe that the gas tax is going to be viable. Now raise your hand if you believe that the gas tax should be increased. And I see 3, I see 4, I see 3, I see 4. I see a maybe out of one of the 4s. Mr. McCarty?
Yes, and the reason I'm hesitant is because I think it has to be part of an overall solution. It can be part of a package.
And that's not my question. My question is whether or not you believe that since 1993, gas tax has been at its current rate. Do you think it should be increased? That's my only question. And you did raise your hand, so right. Do you wish to retract it at this time?
No, I think it has to be part of the package. As I said, we're looking for something that's sustainable long term, and fuel tax will be one of those things that we have to do.
I've got a question it's a little parochial for Mr. McKenna, but for the committee overall. Missouri's received grants for the Surface Transportation Alternative Funding Program for 16 and 17. And I'd be curious, or if you could tell the committee too, what the progress is and how that's moving along and what your thoughts are.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, we did note that as part of the FAST Act, there was $95 million available for looking at alternatives to the fuel tax. We felt that our neighbors to the left and the right were doing a pretty good job of exercising the view toward vehicle miles traveled, and we wanted to look at something else. So we're looking at, in Missouri, the notion of a fuel economy-based adjustment to a registration fee, as another tool in the toolbox, as another means of strengthening our own revenue base in Missouri. So the first round of the grant, we received a small grant, $250,000. That was to study the demographics of the registration database, and that's gone very well. We should be done and concluded with that in December. We did just get the very good news that we get the next round, which is about $2.7 million, and we're going to be taking that information that we've gained from the first round, and we're really looking at the registration database in the state itself and looking to actually implement that type of registration fee. It would be a big upgrade for the state.
We had a lot of talk about, obviously, solvency of the trust fund moving forward, and I know Mr. Schuster and I both believe that we're going to have to do something different because the gas tax is extraordinarily regressive, and it's going to get more so and more so and more so. So we're very interested in alternatives and what we can look at moving forward.
We can't even seem to even out the burden on electric vehicles. But let me throw this to Mr. McKenna here. as talking about getting more into the trust fund, with the increasing numbers of electric vehicles and hybrids and such, and subsidized by state and federal money, sometimes several thousands of dollars of these due to the incentives to buy those vehicles, they contribute a small fraction of what the cost is for using the same roads. So what do you see, Mr. McKenna, across the board, besides California's delayed until 2020, $100? What are you seeing in other states to try and have these vehicles that are wearing out the highways and roads the same as others but not paying any part of that burden?
Thank you for the question. That's actually what we're trying to address with the grant program that Chairman Graves mentioned. We're actually looking at a fuel economy adjustment to the registration fee. So if I'm receiving 40 miles per gallon on my vehicle and you're receiving 20 and we both drive 10,000 miles, you're paying double what I am. Our attempt through this grant program is to look at the ability to create a registration fee that would balance those two. So in fact, all users would be paying the same.
Okay. On one hand, that's funny because we've been cajoled and pushed and prodded into driving smaller, more fuel-efficient vehicles and all that, and then now that the money's running out into the trust fund, it's going back the other way. So how people that watch what we do, either to state level or federal level, wonder what the heck they're supposed to do.
Do any of you have experience in using multiple funding streams in advancing an infrastructure solution that you're working on? Does that question make sense? Meaning integrating various federal funding streams to build a transportation project in your state?
Yes, Representative. We actually use multiple funding streams for almost every construction project we do, large or small. So a combination of federal, state, and local funds. We have a cost share program that can leverage actually local transportation development district sales taxes.
Let me see if I can clarify my question. Certainly you're going to be integrating state and local federal funding streams with federal because there's a cost share on many of these programs. Have you brought other federal streams to the table?
We do try to work with resource agencies. I can't think of any specific ones right now, but I know we have done that, and I could provide some for the record.